The radio is a product which is broadcast over the air using a part of the light spectrum not visible to humans. When you tune in to a radio station, you set your receiver to focus on waves coming in at a particular frequency. One point of interest to us is that radio is a public good. It's both non-rival and non-excludable, which helps explain why it only works as a business through advertising revenue or donations. But the real point I want to make is about the rights to broadcast over a certain frequency. Who should get to choose what plays on 99.9 FM? The answer is that the market chooses. If one station owns 99.9 FM, but another station thinks they would earn more in ad revenue if they had control over 99.9 FM, they would buy the rights from the other station, who would gladly sell them if the offer was indeed more than what they were earning. Property rights find their way to the owners who value that resource the most. But if that is true, then we don't really even need property rights. Whichever station is going to earn the most broadcasting on 99.9 FM is also the one willing to pay the most to others to stop them from broadcasting on that frequency. This applies to the problem of externalities. Imagine that you had work in the morning, but your neighbors were having a loud party that was keeping you from falling asleep. How would a rational economic agent handle this problem? With willingness to pay, of course. You should go to your neighbor, and instead of making demands, you simply offer money in exchange for them turning the music down. If it's worth $40 for you to get a good night's sleep before work, then you could offer that to your neighbor to keep it down. Perhaps your neighbor feels it's worth $30 to be able to keep listening to the loud music. In that case, they would accept your offer, since your $40 is a better option than the $30 of fun they would have listening to loud music. But if they value their good time at $50, then they would refuse you. And, dear economics student, that would be the efficient outcome. In order for an outcome to be economically efficient, we need to be getting the most that we can out of our resources. The use of the resource in question, which in this case is the level of sound in the environment around you, should go to the one willing to pay the most for it, whether or not they actually have to pay. If your neighbor values the party at $50, but you value silence at $40, then the party is generating $10 of economic surplus for society and should go forward. If you and your neighbor are reasonable people, you would settle on a price one pays to the other to abide by the other's preferences. Of course, even the economists can recognize that this is not ever what happens. Nevertheless, there's a very deep and wise insight economists are applying to the situation. Imagine that a train goes along some tracks near a farm. The train's wheels generate some sparks, which start a fire and burn down the farmer's crops. Who's at fault here? The railroad or the farmer? Almost everyone would say it's the railroad, whose sparks are what caused the fire that burned down the farm. But the economist wonders why we blame the railroad when it's the farmer who's the one who planted the crops close to the tracks. There's no fire without the train, but there's also no fire without the farm. Assigning blame isn't as easy as it seems. When we looked at Pigovian taxation, we made the solution to pollution look so easy. Just put a tax on the polluters and you'll solve the problem. But this concept of there being a polluter maybe doesn't make much sense. It seems obvious to people that a factory which emits smog into the air is the one to blame for the air pollution and should be the one that pays for it. But we could alternatively ask everyone affected by the smog to pay the factory to reduce their production. Why should the factory pay people rather than the people pay the factory? I can make this more salient, especially after the pandemic, with vaccines. Should we pay people to get a vaccine, which is a Pigovian subsidy designed to correct a positive externality? Or should we require people who don't get the vaccine to pay everyone else? You could think of the person without the vaccine as a polluter who's polluting society with their coughs and sneezes. But for some reason, we've decided to make the factories pay while paying the people getting a vaccine. It isn't contradictory to have different policies, but insisting that one policy is right in one place but not in another is contradictory. This way of thinking about externalities comes from the great economist Ronald Coase, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. Coase recognized that trying to identify whoever is generating the externality is not a meaningful notion. What's easy to see on a graph is not easy in real life. The real world is much too complicated to simplify into supply and demand and equilibrium. The problem with externalities is a problem of property rights not reaching the right place, and Coase identified what was stopping them. Transaction costs are all the costs necessary to reach an agreement. When your neighbor plays loud music, they're de facto claiming the property rights to the environment around you. If you value those rights more than they do, you should be able to buy your neighbor off and pay them to turn down the music. Of course, city ordinances about noise may give you the property rights, and you can have them enforced by calling the cops and shutting down the party. But if your neighbor values those rights more than you, they should be able to buy you off. That almost never happens, though. Whoever has the property rights stubbornly hangs on to them due to our human emotions. Those emotions are part of the transaction costs of that agreement. They prevent us from reaching an agreement. The Coase Theorem tells us that in our cursed world, transaction costs are high, and so it does matter where the property rights start. And Coase also emphasized that the government will only get it right on accident. If the city ordinances give you the right to shut down the party, that's only the right outcome if you coincidentally value them more than your neighbor. In chapters 1 through 10, we built this blissful world of markets, which lead us to paradise. The price system helps us optimize the use of our resources so that we get the most value we can out of them. But Coase shows us that we live in the second best world, a world of transaction costs, which get in the way of market forces and can prevent us from reaching the optimal outcome. And while government can sometimes help, it just as often becomes the transaction cost in our way.